The Douglas Aircraft Company built many great aircraft over its long history, but one specific airplane is forever etched in the memories of World War II veterans. They remember it under a simple, straightforward name, the Douglas. Of course, we are talking about the legendary DC-3 and its many variants. This aircraft was developed back in 1935. It started as a custom request for American Airlines. At first, it carried the designation DST. When designing this airplane, engineers drew heavily on the success of their previous project, the DC-2. They retained the same basic aerodynamic layout. This was because the predecessor had been a massive hit on the aviation market. That's exactly why the new DC-3 was designed from the ground up for large-scale mass production. And the company made the right call. Airlines snapped up the new DC-3s incredibly fast. Very soon, these aircraft filled the skies all over the world. Following their experience with the previous model, the Soviet Union also bought about 24 new DC-3s. Over there, they were heavily used in civil aviation for both domestic and international flights. They were also used by the Air Force as military transports. DC-3s with red stars on their wings provided logistical support during the battles of Khalkhin Gol. Later, they served during the Winter War. Eventually, they continued their service on the front lines of World War II. Interestingly, alongside buying fully assembled airframes, the Soviet Union also purchased a license to manufacture the DC-3 themselves. At first, production was set up at the Khimki Aviation Plant under the designation PS-84. Later on, during the war years, a slightly modified version of this transport was assembled in Tashkent. It was built under the designation Li-2. The aircraft received this name in honor of Boris Pavlovich Lisunov. He was the engineer who managed the process of setting up its production line. When the United States entered the war, its military transport fleet wasn't exactly in the best shape. The military only had a handful of converted civilian airliners and some frankly obsolete bombers at their disposal. Because of this, the first move by the Army was to requisition aircraft straight off the assembly lines before they could be delivered to their buyers. Among these were a massive number of DC-3s in various configurations. And by early 1942, full-scale production of the legendary C-47 Skytrain was officially underway. This military version featured large cargo doors on the port side. It also had a heavily reinforced cabin floor for hauling heavy equipment and supplies. Very quickly, the C-47 became the most widely produced military transport aircraft across all the Allied nations. Under the Lend-Lease program, these reliable aircraft were shipped to the Soviet Union in massive numbers. The first batch of 25 C-47s was originally scheduled for delivery back in May and June of 1942. However, due to a series of logistical and bureaucratic delays, the first 7 aircraft didn't arrive at Ladd Field in Alaska until September. Soviet pilots arrived from Chukotka on September 25th to pick them up. But the process stalled here too. The American side paused the handover until they received official clearance. This clearance didn't come through until early October. Finally, on October 10th, the Soviet pilots took delivery of the first 6 planes. They successfully crossed the Bering Strait and headed down the famous Al-Sib route. This route connected Fairbanks, Alaska, with Krasnoyarsk in the Soviet Union. By March 1943, the Soviet Union had received a total of 30 C-47s, but deliveries soon started ramping up. In total, the United States allocated 709 of these transports. Exactly 707 aircraft successfully made it to the transfer point in Alaska. All of them were handed over to the Soviet mission. A total of 704 aircraft made it all the way to Krasnoyarsk. There were at least 2 fatal C-47 crashes during these difficult ferry flights. One happened in late May 1943 at Krasnoyarsk itself. The other occurred a year later, in May 1944, near the Chukchi village of Welkal. The Soviet Union received several variants of this transport. Among them was the C-47A model. This version featured upgraded electrical and radio equipment. Another variant was the C-47B. The C-47B was equipped with powerful, high-altitude IR 1830-90 engines. It also had the option to install an extra fuel tank right in the main cabin. The baseline C-47 was designed with 28 passenger seats. The C-47A and C-47B variants seated 27. And if you pulled out all the seats, the airplane turned into a flying hospital. It was capable of taking on anywhere from 18 to 24 wounded troops on stretchers. The Soviet military officially designated all these variants as the C-47. But crews affectionately dubbed both the American C-47s and the domestically built Lee-2s simply as the Douglas. There's a perfectly logical explanation for that. Externally, these aircraft are incredibly similar. Even today, professional historians and aviation experts have a really hard time telling them apart. Even now, you can easily stumble across archival or online photos of an American C-47 mistakenly captioned as a Soviet Lee-2. Telling the visual differences between a pre-war DC-3 and an early Soviet PS-84 is a real head-scratcher. For the average person, it was always just the good old Douglas. The first C-47s were assigned to fly the famous Krasnoyarsk route, which was the official Soviet name for this air corridor. These new aircraft replaced the heavily worn-out PS-84 transports that had been flying there previously. In the spring, specifically in April 1943, these C-47s were organized into a separate transport squadron. This squadron was made up of 20 experienced crews. By early summer, this squadron had been expanded into a full transport regiment. Viktor Andreevich Pushchinsky took command of the unit. The C-47s in this regiment handled a massive workload. They hauled personnel and all sorts of cargo. This ranged from top-secret mail and high-value instruments to everyday items like ordinary lipstick. On top of that, they acted as lead ships for formations of smaller aircraft. These smaller planes lacked advanced navigation equipment. These crews also pulled off complex rescue operations and helped ferry other C-47s along the route. Interestingly, the route commander, the legendary polar pilot Ilya Pavlovich Mazuruk, had his very own personal Douglas. It flew under the call sign Leader 100 and sported nose art featuring a stylized polar bear. Eventually, these state-of-the-art aircraft started making their way to other military units as well. Interestingly, one of the very first C-47s ended up in the Air Force Inspectorate Regiment, which was the personal pet project of Vasily Stalin. It became standard practice that every regiment would automatically receive at least one of these transports to handle routine logistics. This applied to both bomber and fighter units. However, the lion's share of C-47s still ended up in dedicated transport units, and for good reason. Unlike the Douglas, the Soviet Lee-2 was a dual-purpose aircraft. At least this was true as it was built by the Tashkent aviation plant during the war. It could serve as both a transport and a long-range night bomber. The C-47, on the other hand, was designed strictly as a dedicated transport. That's why the Lee-2s mostly went to long-range aviation units. Meanwhile, the C-47s were handed over to logistics branches, although sometimes a few C-47s did find their way into regiments flying the Lee-2. For example, one bomber regiment had 3 C-47s on its roster. These aircraft were used for special missions and general utility hauling. They also acted as a sort of flying workshop whenever other aircraft in the unit made forced landings. Starting in the summer of 1943, C-47s began entering Soviet transport units in massive numbers. The largest concentration of these transports was gathered in a transport division based out of Vnukovo airfield near Moscow. These aircraft were also assigned to liaison units and independent regiments operating right on the front lines. By the end of the war, practically every frontline transport regiment had a detachment of 5 Lee-2 or C-47 aircraft as a standard part of its complement. It's safe to say that the Douglas transports, alongside the Soviet Lee-2s, became the absolute backbone of Soviet military transport aviation. And even though they were heavily outnumbered by light aircraft like the U-2, P-5, or R-5, these large transports handled over half of all airlift operations. The C-47s moved large volumes of critical cargo during the Soviet Army's numerous large-scale offensives. For example, they were instrumental in keeping urgent supplies and ammunition flowing without interruption. This happened during the heaviest fighting of the Battle of Kursk. Shortly after, in February and March 1944, a special task force operated with high efficiency around Melitopol. It consisted of 9 C-47s commanded by an experienced officer, Boris Labutin. During the brutal spring and fall mud seasons known as the Rasputitsa, Ground vehicles were completely bogged down in the muck. At these times, tactical airlift was often the only thing keeping the army moving. It was essential for maintaining the offensive's high operational tempo. Flying directly into active combat zones, these aircraft kept frontline troops supplied with fresh ammo, heavy artillery shells, food, winter boots, and combat gear. On the return leg, the transports evacuated severely wounded soldiers from the front. Flying these short routes meant crews faced exhausting physical strain. They were often flying 5 or 6 sorties in a single day. On top of that, C-47s played a massive role in supplying the famous cavalry mechanized group commanded by General Issa Pliyev. They acted as a highly reliable airborne supply line. When the massive offensive near Leningrad launched in the summer of 1944, C-47 crews from several frontline transport regiments took on a highly demanding job. They handled the rapid forward deployment of ground personnel for an entire air army. They quickly relocated military headquarters and flew non-stop supply runs with critical cargo right up to the front lines. These aircraft performed similar vital work during the large-scale offensive operations in Belarus. Overall, the role of these transport fleets was highly significant during the battles to liberate right-bank Ukraine, the Crimean Peninsula, and the Baltic states. During the most intense days of the push, the operational tempo reached a peak. Crews could fly up to 8 or even 10 sorties in a single 24-hour period. For such heavy and physically demanding transport aircraft, that was a heavy workload. Nighttime partisan resupply missions formed a completely separate, crucial chapter in the history of these aircraft. While the brunt of this tough work usually fell on pilots flying light and rugged biplanes like the U-2 and R-5, you have to remember one thing, just one. Li-2 or C-47 transport could haul as much cargo as 10 of those little biplanes combined. So if there was a suitable landing strip carved out in the woods, the big Douglases would head in under the cover of darkness. If there was no place to land, vital supplies were simply airdropped deep behind German lines. Naturally, these night missions were dangerous. For example, on September 21, 1943, a C-47 piloted by Lieutenant Alexander Borovsky was dropping ammo for partisans near the city of Lubny. An enemy flak shell exploded right in the tail section of his aircraft, but thanks to the pilot's skill, the crew managed to limp the crippled plane back to their home airfield. Overall, C-47s were heavily involved in dropping essential supplies to partisan groups in the forests of Karelia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Right before the massive Soviet offensive in 1944, transport crews supplied arms and ammo to 19 partisan brigades. They airdropped over 22 tons of explosives into the Belarusian forests. Soviet transport squadrons played a crucial role during the offensives in Romania, Poland, and Hungary. They supported the troops all the way to Berlin and Prague. It was the Li-2 and C-47 aircraft that formed the backbone of a massive air bridge. This bridge connected Ukrainian territory to an uprising in Slovakia in 1944. The transports would land directly at Zvolin airfield in Slovakia, flying in reinforcements and supplies. When German forces finally crushed the uprising, the airfield had to be hurriedly evacuated. Under heavy enemy mortar fire, the last aircraft took off from that strip. It was a C-47 commanded by Ivan Ivanovich Ryzhkov. This flight was critical because it carried a Hungarian opposition delegation on their way to negotiations. Later on, C-47 transport crews were heavily involved in the final battle for Berlin, flying countless logistics missions. Transport aviation's performance was just as impressive during the short but fast-paced campaign in the Far East. The rate of the advance there was so rapid that the lead armored columns simply outran their supply lines. Aircraft became the only way to keep them supplied with fuel. A standard Li-2 could usually carry 8 to 10 55-gallon drums of diesel fuel. Meanwhile, the C-47, with its higher payload capacity, easily hauled 12 drums at once. Along with fuel, critically needed ammo was airdropped using the exact same methods. Small groups of transports were constantly dropping tactical airborne units into Harbin, Mukden, Jilin, Port Arthur, and several other strategic hotspots. In an incredible historical footnote, it was aboard a Douglas that Colonel Ivan Hryhorovich Artemenko flew into the city of Changchun. His purpose was to personally deliver a surrender ultimatum to the command of the Japanese Kwantung Army. And it was on the same aircraft type that the captured Emperor of Manchuria, Puyi, was later flown to the Soviet Union. Overall, the American C-47 outclassed its Soviet counterpart, the Lee-2, in a number of ways. The powerful twin-row R-1830 radial engines gave the aircraft a much higher speed. This speed was around 225 miles per hour at an altitude of over 7,500 feet. Plus, the transport had a higher service ceiling and could carry a heavier payload. But the biggest advantage for the ground crews was how well these engines were mounted and how easy they were to maintain. Just for comparison, replacing a single M62IR radial on the Soviet Lee-2 took mechanics a grueling 62 man-hours of hard work. But on the C-47, changing an engine and its mount took just 10 hours. Sure, at first it was tough for Soviet mechanics to retrain on foreign tech. But once they got the hang of servicing these American radials, the power plants didn't just reach their factory-rated time between overhauls, or TBO. They actually lasted 1.5 to 2 times longer. The higher manufacturing standards at U.S. factories meant the overall build quality of the airframe was outstanding. The American aircraft turned out to be much more reliable. Its flush riveting and smooth outer skin gave it noticeably better aerodynamics. Compared to the Lee-2, the fuel and hydraulic systems were also superior. American valves and fittings rarely leaked, unlike the Soviet parts. This was an absolute godsend for the mechanics. Another major advantage was the double cargo doors on the C-47. They conveniently swung outward to the sides. They were also much wider than the hatch on the Lee-2, which awkwardly hinged upward. This was a design flaw the Soviet aircraft inherited from the experimental PS-84K. On top of that, you could fit 2 auxiliary fuel bladders inside the cabin, holding nearly 100 gallons each. This pushed the maximum flight range to an impressive 2,100 miles. And some frontline mechanics even managed to install larger custom tanks. This allowed the aircraft to remain airborne for a solid 24 hours. When you look at the instruments and radio gear, the American C-47 was miles ahead of the Soviet Lee-2. It featured a much more comprehensive instrument panel. The gauges were far more accurate, reliable, and durable. Soviet radio operators on the Lee-2 could only look on in envy when they saw the equipment on the American aircraft. They came packed with 3 separate radio sets, a radar altimeter, and a specialized blind landing receiver. They even had an automatic direction finder, or ADF. Plus, the American radios were 5 or 6 times more powerful. They were also infinitely more reliable, lighter, and more compact. Another interesting detail was that on the C-47, the radio operator station was moved away from the propeller arc. It was placed in a dedicated compartment with excellent soundproofing. There was really only one downside. These Lend-Lease aircraft were delivered with an incomplete set of equipment. The U.S. Army Air Forces packed a lot more gear into their own planes. This was pretty obvious from the empty mounting brackets and extra placards left in the export versions. But even in this somewhat stripped-down form, the American C-47 was light years ahead of any transport aircraft or bomber in the Soviet fleet. American engineers also did a fantastic job winterizing the C-47 to handle extremely low temperatures. They equipped it with absolutely all the cutting-edge tech of the era. The wings and tail surfaces were fitted with pneumatic de-icing boots. The propeller blades and cockpit windshields were sprayed with an alcohol anti-icing mixture. Both the cockpit and the main cabin had modern forced air heating. The Goodrich pneumatic boots worked significantly better than the Soviet exhaust-heated alternatives. Likewise, pilots much preferred the American hydraulically driven windshield wipers over the electric ones found on the Lee-2. The crews absolutely loved the comfortable American heating system. By comparison, the Soviet Lee-2 had an outdated steam air system that relied on an actual water boiler. The flight engineer who had to maintain it was jokingly called the stoker. He really had to work up a sweat to get that heater running properly. And if something went wrong, the system would instantly spit out a thick cloud of hot steam. This completely filled the cockpit and dropped visibility to 0. To get the Soviet Lee-2 up in the air, you had to warm up the engines for a long time before takeoff. This usually took around 40 to 45 minutes. But the American Douglas featured a clever gasoline-based oil dilution system. It thinned out the oil not just in the engines themselves, but right down into the propeller hubs. On top of that, the Americans wisely filled the hydraulic system with a specialized cold weather fluid. During the brutal winters in the Soviet Union, the only thing on the C-47 that needed extra insulation was the oil lines between the engine and the oil tank. Overall, the C-47 proved to be an incredibly reliable and efficient aircraft. According to historical statistics, in the first half of 1945, the accident rate per aircraft for the C-47 was 2.5 times lower than that of the Soviet Lee-2. In May 1943, the Soviet command formed a special, long-range night reconnaissance unit that flew the C-47. Having only 3 to 5 of these Douglas transports at their disposal, these pilots flew over 100 sorties deep into enemy territory in just over a year. Additionally, they delivered personnel and critical cargo to forward airstrips almost 300 times. Later, while flying special operations missions, by September alone they had dropped over 200 scouts behind the front lines. They also delivered almost 200,000 pounds of supplies and ammunition. In the summer of 1944, 12 C-47s made a massive ferry flight from the Soviet Union to Bari, Italy. That is where an aviation group commanded by Major General Vasil Ivanovich Shelkunov began intensive operations. Their aircraft provided logistical support for the Yugoslav National Liberation Army. On the outbound leg, they hauled ammunition, weapons, and critically needed medical supplies. On the return trip, they evacuated wounded fighters. On top of that, these transports ferried 4 disassembled U-2 biplanes from the Soviet Union to Italy. These aircraft were later handed over to the Yugoslav forces. One of their most famous operations was a flight on June 4th. A crew led by pilot Oleksandr Serhiyovich Shornikov managed to evacuate the partisan Supreme Headquarters along with Marshal Josip Broz Tito. They flew right out of Drvar, a town which was completely surrounded by German troops at the time. In September of that same year, another notable operation unfolded. Soviet pilot Alexander Petrovich Dimov was ordered to find and capture a special train deep inside Bulgaria. Members of the Bulgarian royal family and government ministers were trying to flee on it, along with German and Italian diplomats. 25 armed paratroopers packed into the Douglas transport. 4 A-20 Boston bombers escorted the C-47 to provide cover. They finally spotted the train just short of the Bulgarian-Turkish border. Alexander Petrovich Dimov demonstrated a high level of piloting skill. He put his fully loaded twin-engine transport down on a tiny dirt strip right next to the railroad tracks. The paratroopers deployed quickly and stopped the train. They secured the area until the main reinforcements arrived. The C-47s were constantly tapped for highly classified and critical missions. For instance, in October 1944, one of these transports successfully airlifted the gold and silver reserves of the Slovak National Bank back to Soviet territory. And it was a C-47 flown by pilot Alexei Ivanovich Semenkov that delivered the historic documents of Germany's unconditional surrender to Moscow. The advantages of the legendary Douglas were so obvious that the top Soviet leadership simply could not ignore them. High-ranking officials across the board openly preferred the American C-47 over the domestically built Lee-2. Joseph Stalin personally set the tone for this trend. When it came time to fly to the historic Tehran conference, he specifically chose a C-47. It was flown by Colonel Viktor Ivanovich Grachev from an elite special purpose regiment. This was despite the fact that a factory in Tashkent had custom-built 5 PS-84 transports, specifically for this critical mission. A special Civil Air Fleet detachment operated the American C-47s. They handled top priority government flights both inside and outside the Soviet Union. Eventually, this unit was expanded into a full-fledged transport regiment with 24 C-47s and 5 Lee-2s. This was the very unit that operated the first international air routes opened right in the middle of World War II. Their route network was impressive. You could find crews flying these transports in the skies over London, Cairo, Washington, and Basra. For instance, in the fall of 1944, they launched a regular air service to Sweden. This was less of a passenger run and more of a strategic cargo route. They were continuously hauling crates of those famous Swedish ball bearings out of Stockholm. These were absolutely critical for the Soviet defense industry. In January 1945, the route network expanded even further. C-47 transports began flying regular routes from Moscow to Tehran. There, they connected with the global air routes operated by the United States military's Air Transport Command. To ensure this route ran reliably, the Americans transferred 10 more C-47s to the Soviet Union. Thanks to this, by the end of the war, the elite transport regiment had about 50 of these dependable aircraft in their fleet. However, using the C-47 to carry VIPs had one major drawback. The onboard conditions were just too Spartan. After all, from the very beginning, this aircraft was built primarily for the harsh realities of hauling military cargo. To solve this, engineers started heavily modifying the airframes. At first, the passenger cabins were brought up to the PS-84 standard, but eventually they rolled out genuinely luxurious VIP variants for the top brass. A great example happened in August 1944, when a C-47 underwent an extensive modernization. Right behind the cockpit, they installed 2 extra fuel tanks to extend the range. Then they set up dedicated sleeping quarters for the crew directly on top of them. A special partition separated this work area from the main cabin. Inside that main cabin, they put in 12 large, comfortable seats and a convenient table. They also covered the floor with soft carpeting. It was on this very VIP transport that a crew commanded by Grigory Stepanovich Benkunsky successfully flew the Soviet delegation to the international conference at Dumbarton Oaks. In 1944 and 1945, deliveries of the new C-47A and C-47B models began ramping up rapidly. Interestingly, starting in the fall of 1944, the iconic Soviet markings were painted on the fuselages right at the American factories. These markings featured the red stars with a white outline. Throughout the spring of 1945, the war drew to a close. During this time, a continuous stream of C-47A transports flew along the legendary ferry route through Alaska and Siberia. They flew alongside B-25 bombers. Even after the unconditional surrender of Germany, the United States kept delivering airplanes. This was done under a special supply program for the Pacific Theater of Operations. As their fleet of modern aircraft steadily grew, Soviet civil aviation was able to dedicate some airplanes to the most critical domestic routes. For instance, a special group of C-47s was tasked with airlifting nickel out of the remote northern cities of Vorkuta and Dudinka. In total, they hauled over 1,600 tons of this strategic metal along that route. On top of that, these same reliable transports were used for a much more delicate mission. They were used for flying gold out of Magadan. By the way, the powerful regional NKVD directorate in the Far East actually had its own C-47 at its disposal. It flew regular government shuttles between Krasnoyarsk and Magadan. These transports also saw heavy use on routes to Baku, Tbilisi, Krasnodar, Kuybyshev, and many other cities. But all of that was just classic transport work. A much more interesting story is how the air arm of the Northern Fleet used the C-47. They used it to hunt U-boats in the harsh conditions of the Arctic. Of course, the airplane could not carry bombs since it simply wasn't built for that. However, its massive fuel capacity allowed it to spend hours patrolling the most remote stretches of the ocean. It reached places where other types of aircraft physically could not go. To carry out these missions in the spring of 1944, naval aviators were handed a few C-47s from the Long Range Aviation Command. They had occasionally been pressed into service for similar missions before that. For example, in the fall of 1943, one of these aircraft helped escort an Arctic convoy near Kolguyev Island. Later on, large PBY flying boats arrived from the United States. The long-range anti-submarine patrol role was fully taken over by them. Then the C-47s went back to their usual transport duties. In total, Soviet naval aviation received 10 of these airplanes. They were based near Moscow and attached to transport units across the fleets. And in one of the air divisions, a C-47 was actually converted into a true airborne command post for its commander. It came complete with a comfortable cabin and a full suite of the latest radio communication equipment. Unlike the Soviet Li-2, the American C-47 transport wasn't originally equipped with any standard defensive armament. Overall, this was pretty typical for United States transport aircraft. The Americans rarely armed their transports. Initially, the Soviets followed suit. But there is a key difference to keep in mind. The United States Army Air Forces almost always operated with complete air superiority. For Soviet crews, however, flying right along the front lines was a serious liability. It was even more dangerous when flying deep into enemy territory without defenses. The fighting in Slovakia is a perfect example. Even though C-47s made up just a fraction of the Soviet long-range aviation fleet, they accounted for nearly half of the combat losses of the Corps. To give the crews a fighting chance, they started retrofitting some C-47s with dorsal turrets. These 47s were the first Soviet aircraft to be equipped with a dorsal turret, 47s with dorsal turrets. These turrets housed 50 caliber machine guns, similar to the Lee-2. Sometimes they even went as far as mounting an extra pair of rapid-fire machine guns right in the aft cabin windows. United States deliveries of the C-47 stopped completely right after the victory over Japan. The final aircraft left the American base in Fairbanks on September 8th, flown by Pavel Gamov's crew. By the end of October, all remaining airframes had finally been assigned to their operational units. The vast majority of these transports stayed in Air Force service, hauling cargo and ferrying command personnel. These aircraft played an active role in major post-war exercises, especially during mass paratroop drops. What's more, the C-47 played a pivotal role in a classified military polar expedition in the spring of 1950. At the time, the Soviet High Command was practicing the setup of temporary ice airfields. These would serve as staging bases for potential strikes against the United States from the north. LA-11 escort fighters took part in this high-risk operation alongside Tu-2 and Tu-4 bombers. Meanwhile, the logistical heavy lifting relied on dependable C-47s and Soviet IL-12s, operating alongside cargo gliders. On the civilian side, Soviet civil aviation had over 100 American-built Douglases on hand by early 1946. These reliable airframes formed a special detachment that eventually evolved into a full International Routes Directorate. They flew scheduled routes from Moscow to major European capitals. These included Prague, Sofia, Budapest, Bucharest, Warsaw, Berlin, and even Rome. Interestingly, the passenger aircraft in this international detachment flew with military markings. They kept red stars on the wings and fuselage for a long time after the war. In 1947, an American-built C-47 even flew a major diplomatic mission. It safely transported the first Soviet embassy staff to Calcutta in newly independent India. Later on, civil maintenance depots converted 125 cargo C-47s into dedicated passenger airliners. Right up until the mid-1950s, these aircraft served as the backbone of the Soviet Aeroflot fleet. However, with no official support from the United States, severe spare parts shortages inevitably set in. Engineers had to improvise. They gradually swapped out American avionics and electrical systems for whatever Soviet equivalents they could get their hands on. They treated the original Pratt & Whitney R-1830 engines like gold. In the Soviet Union, each one went through 2 or even 3 major overhauls. But heavy wear and tear is inevitable, and those engines could not run forever. Engineers Mashevets and Lipsky came up with a solution. At the Vnukovo Aircraft Repair Facility, they began a mass conversion of the American airframes to take Soviet AS-62 IR radial engines. These modified aircraft were given a new designation, the TS-62. For the most part, they retained all the original C-47 systems, except for the power plants. There was one interesting detail. The new engines featured specialized winter cowling shutters modeled after the Soviet Lee-2. They were updated with hydraulic actuators instead of outdated manual cable linkages. Naturally, the performance of the TS-62 fell slightly short of the original C-47, but it still outperformed the Soviet Lee-2 thanks to its superior aerodynamics. Pilots also noticed an interesting quirk. After the aircraft were repainted in the Soviet Union, their top speed always dropped a bit. It turned out the original American factory paint was simply much smoother. These hybrid aircraft saw heavy use in the civilian fleet in both passenger and cargo configurations. Meanwhile, down in Tajikistan, a similar variant called the TS-82 was taking to the skies. These were essentially the same C-47 airframes. However, they were fitted with more powerful AS-82FN engines. This modification really paid off. The aircraft gained better high-altitude performance. Also, at cruise speed, the TS-82 easily outpaced the brand-new Soviet IL-12. Overall, both the original C-47s and their TS-62 hybrids were in huge demand for polar aviation. To handle the harsh conditions of the far north, they were retrofitted with massive auxiliary fuel tanks. For instance, shortly after the war, the famous polar explorer Mark Abramovich Titloff made an incredible non-stop flight across the western Arctic in one of these aircraft. He stayed airborne for a full 24 hours. To adapt the airframes for snow operations, polar pilots showed some serious ingenuity. They often mounted the American C-47s on ski landing gear borrowed from Soviet Lee-2s. Soviet polar crews also got their hands on a very rare aircraft, the R-4D. This was the Navy equivalent of the famous C-47. It was built specifically for United States naval aviation and featured slightly different equipment. Interestingly, the Soviet Union never officially purchased this particular airframe. It was found completely by accident in the spring of 1954. It was just abandoned on a drifting ice floe in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. It later turned out that the American crew had left it there after a major mechanical failure back in March 1952. Soviet specialists decided to give the aircraft a second life. To repair their find, they flew an old C-47 out to that exact same ice floe. This was an airframe the Soviet Air Force was already preparing to strike off the register. They simply used it as a parts donor. By June, the repaired R-4D got airborne and flew to the Kresty Polar Airfield. However, the aircraft ultimately met a tragic fate. Just 6 months later, it crashed heavily while landing at the North Pole 3 ice station. Damaged beyond repair, this rare aircraft met a very humble end. Its fuselage was repurposed into a standard polar bathhouse. Throughout the first half of the 1950s, Soviet civil aviation made extensive use of American C-47s. They operated alongside their TS-62 and TS-82 variants. In 1957, these airframes still had plenty of airframe life left and could have remained airworthy. However, the Ministry of Civil Aviation decided to retire them. Yet for years to come, Soviet pilots fondly remembered the high level of comfort, the attention to detail, and the superior build quality of these American transports. The C-47 had a massive impact on the design of the first Soviet post-war passenger airliners. If you look at the technical requirements for new aircraft laid out by the Soviet Civil Air Fleet Research Institute in 1946, they basically described the C-47 word for word. There were even extensive lists of American equipment rush, ordered for reverse engineering. A lot of clever engineering solutions from Douglas eventually found their way onto Soviet aircraft. For instance, the cargo doors on the IL-12 were practically identical to the doors on the C-47. And the heating and ventilation systems on the IL-14 were almost exact replicas of the American originals. When the new IL-12 rolled out in the late 1940s, it began to overshadow the older Lee-2s and C-47s. But this Soviet aircraft had so many teething problems that it never really managed to completely surpass the American transport. It wasn't until the arrival of the much more modern IL-14 that crews finally began to admit the era of the C-47 and the PS-84 was truly drawing to a close. But around the world, C-47s continue to fly to this day. These historic workhorses have seen action in nearly every military conflict since their introduction. Thanks to its phenomenal reliability, ruggedness, and efficiency, this aircraft, just like its Soviet counterpart, the Lee-2, has rightfully earned its status as a true legend of global aviation. Like you'd expect from a true workhorse, the C-47 wasn't exactly known for bright or varied paint schemes. The aircraft delivered to the Soviet Union had just one standard livery. This was the classic United States military camouflage. The top and sides of the fuselage were painted olive drab, while the underside was neutral gray. The only real visual difference from one airframe to another was the demarcation line between these two colors. It could be perfectly straight or wavy, and those waves could be either tightly scalloped or loosely waved. Also, back near the tail, this line usually swept smoothly up toward the horizontal stabilizer, though sometimes it ran straight all the way down the fuselage to the tail cone. The bare metal Douglases, or those sporting complex multicolor camo schemes, rarely ended up in the Soviet Union. They mostly operated in other theaters. Still, there were a few notable exceptions. The most striking examples were the DC-3 transports that flew supply missions during the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939. Their bare metal airframes were completely covered in dense green or brown lines. This created a seaweed-like pattern. This camouflage was so dense that the red star insignia and tactical numbers almost got lost in it. Other aircraft with light base coats received similar camouflage treatments. These included the SB bombers and I-153 fighters. After that, this unusual camo was only used one more time in Soviet aviation. It was applied to a few MBR-2 flying boats serving with the Northern Fleet. Additionally, during the war, a few C-47s were delivered where the base olive drab was broken up by medium green splotches. These were painted on the wingtips, the tail surfaces, and the engine cowlings. During the first winters of the war, Soviet mechanics would apply a washable white distemper over the standard camo. This helped the aircraft blend in with the snow, and if an aircraft needed a field repaint, they just used whatever standard Soviet green or dark gray paints they happened to have on hand. When deliveries first started, the American C-47s arrived in the Soviet Union. They carried their original United States markings, which consisted of a white star inside a blue circle. Soviet ground crews would just paint their red stars right over the white American ones. They usually left the blue circular background exactly as it was. A little later on, they started rolling out of the factory with markings adapted for the Soviets. These featured red stars inside a white circle on the fuselage and under the wings. But since that white was way too visible, it compromised the aircraft's camouflage. Crews often just painted over the circles as soon as the planes reached their frontline units. It wasn't until the fall of 1944 that American factories finally started applying the familiar Soviet stars. These had a thin outline and no circles around them. All the American aircraft had highly visible yellow serial numbers painted on the tail. The numbering system was straightforward. The first digit indicated the year of manufacture. The numbers following it made up the aircraft's actual serial number. Military bureaucracies love standardization, and the Soviet Union was no exception. Because of this, these factory numbers were almost never painted over. Often, during heavy combat operations, those tail numbers were the only way to actually identify a specific airframe. In combat units, though, crews usually painted additional tactical numbers. They used all sorts of colors over the base factory camouflage. Interestingly, these were unusually large for the Soviet Air Force. Sometimes they even featured massive 4-digit numbers. As for the transports destined to end up in civilian aviation after the war, they received standard civil registrations. They also featured familiar white lettering like Aeroflot or Polar Aviation. Nose art or overly flashy custom paint jobs on C-47 transports were extremely rare. This was probably directly tied to the more pragmatic, no-nonsense nature of transport crews. For instance, aircraft belonging to the 2nd Special Purpose Aviation Division simply featured a painted arrow on the upper tail. The color of this arrow indicated their specific regiment. But there were some truly unique exceptions. The Airborne Command Post was used by long-range aviation general Yevgeny Fedorovich Loginov starting in 1944. It wasn't just heavily modified on the inside. It also had a highly unusual exterior paint scheme. On both sides of the tail section, it sported a red flag. This flag had the proud inscription, 2nd Guards, Bryansk Regiment. The fuselage itself was covered in mottled green camouflage. The military stars with white outlines were placed over blue circles. According to multiple accounts, the aircraft's nose was painted bright red. Looking at the finer technical details, C-47 propeller blades were traditionally painted a flat black. Their tips stood out in bright yellow. Meanwhile, the leading edges were left unpainted, shining as bare metal. Special rubber de-icing boots were installed on the leading edges of the wings. They were also placed on the horizontal and vertical stabilizers. When the aircraft rolled right off the assembly line, these boots were a rich, solid black. But under heavy operational use and constant exposure to the elements, they would fade to a dark gray. The interior of the cockpit itself was painted in standard interior green. On the other hand, the landing gear wheel wells and similar technical compartments were always coated in high-visibility zinc chromate yellow.